Hi everyone, welcome back to my training series entitled Understanding EMV. This is the 21st video in the series, and in this video we will be looking at the EMV transaction, step 9. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's do a recap before we commence to today's content. So where we are right now is we've got Bob at the comic book store looking to buy a pair of socks. The teller has rung up the purchase and asked Bob how would he like to pay for it. Bob has suggested that he's going to pay with his card, and so he whips out his EMV card. He inserts it into the EMV compliant device. So we know that we have selected EMV as the technology for this transaction. Okay, then the card and the terminal, they start to exchange some information and basically decide that they will, with Bob's input, decide that for this transaction we are going to be using the primary application on the card, which is Bob's credit card. Okay, so that is selected. Once the application is selected, the terminal application now have a conversation and they exchange some meaningful data with one another. We then go into step 4 of the transaction, where the terminal verifies that the card is authentic. Thereafter, we go into step 5, and in step 5, we validate that the transaction itself is valid. We move on to step 6, and in step 6, we verify that the card holder, that is Bob, is the genuine or the authorized card holder for this transaction. The terminal then goes into a phase of terminal risk management, which then results in phase 8 or step 8, which is terminal action analysis. Okay. Once this is complete, this brings us into step 9, which is now card action analysis, and card action analysis is the topic of discussion of this video. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Okay, so card action analysis, or CAA, is performed inside the card, okay, to determine if the transaction should be processed offline or online. So remember we said we had TRM, terminal risk management, and then terminal action analysis, and that happened strictly on the terminal from the terminal's perspective. So we have a similar process now that occurs within the card, and all of this internal processing as it happens is not shared with the terminal. So it's not really present on any logs, should you try to interrogate the conversation between the card and terminal at this point. Based on card action and analysis processing, okay, the card will now decide how to respond to the gen AC command that was issued by the terminal as a result of terminal action analysis. As part of card action analysis, as I mentioned just now, the card will perform card risk management internally. Okay, and this is done using the following data. Okay, the card looks at its card issuer action codes, the CIAC. Remember we discussed this in the issuing parameters sections a few videos back. Okay, so if it was a MasterCard card, then it would be card issue action codes. If it was a Visa card, then it would be application default action. And obviously, depending on the other brands, Amex, Diners, etc., that they could have different names for these sets of action codes. Okay, the card also uses transaction counters, which we've discussed in one of the previous videos around the counters in the EMV issuing section, and it looked at the amount counters, which is covered in the same section. So card risk management involves comparing the results of CVR, okay, which is card verification results, against the card issuer action code or ADA values or whatever else it could be. And the process is very similar to the process we discussed recently, where we said we had a TVR, a terminal verification results that was generated by the terminal, and we compared the conditions present here against the rules that were present on the issuer action codes and the terminal action codes. So same process, except that this is from the card's perspective. So it's using a report internal to the card, which it generates, which is now called card verification results, okay, or CVR. Also very important, very useful in interrogating what happened in a transaction. And so CVR contains the conditions and the rules that it's compared against are from the CIACs or the ADA values that have been personalized on the card, which are never shared with the terminal. Okay. So we look at CVR in greater detail when we get to the EMV hex and binary section later on in the training series. But yeah, just to reiterate, the same principle applies as with TVR in terminal action analysis. Okay, so a set of conditions will be compared against a set of rules. Okay, I'm just repeating myself here. So the conditions are present on the CVR, and the rules obviously are the action codes personalized on the card. The card will now consider possible outcomes using the following two inputs. Okay, input one is the suggestion on the terminal as a result of terminal action analysis. So if you recall in the previous video, we spoke about the card doing terminal action analysis, and what it does is, it does its risk management and then makes a suggestion to the card saying, I think we should decline this transaction, or I think we should go online, etc. Right? So the card has to take this into account. Remember the golden rule of EMV, the strictest rule applies. So it would need to assess, what the feedback was from the terminal, and then do a determination in terms of how strict the suggestion was when compared to the card's own, card risk management process. Okay. So obviously the second input that will be used by the card for card action analysis will be the result of card risk management, right? So using these inputs and applying the golden rule of EMV, remember the golden rule of EMV, the strictest rule always applies. The card will now make the final decision as per Order 66. And what this means is that the card is responsible for the final decision here. Okay. So even though the card makes that final decision, okay, just always remember the golden rule applies. So the card is bound to obey the golden rule, which is always apply the strictest rule. Okay, so the following logic. So let's talk about an AAC, right? So where terminal requests that the card generate an AAC cryptogram, which basically says decline this transaction offline. So the following logic will be used, right? So when looking at terminal action analysis and its own CRM, does the card find a reason to decline this transaction? Okay. If yes, the card will then generate the actual cryptogram itself, the actual AAC cryptogram, the application authentication cryptogram. Okay, and this will result in a transaction being declined. If no, so if the card has compared the output of terminal action analysis and it's compared it against the output of its own card risk management, and neither of these two inputs suggest a decline is required, then the card can't issue a decline, right? So it will then cascade down to the next strictest rule, which is let's try to go online, right? So an ARQC. Right, so remember ARQC is an application request cryptogram, and what it basically means is let's send this online to get some additional input from the card issuer host system. So the following logic will be used here, right? So when looking at terminal action analysis and card risk management, does the card find the reason to send the transaction online to the issuer? Okay. If the answer is yes, then the card will formally generate an ARQC cryptogram, an authorization request cryptogram, okay, which will result in a transaction being sent online. If the answer is no, then the card will attempt to apply the next strictest rule. And the next strictest rule in this case, obviously, would be the default to approve the transaction, which we call a TC or transaction certificate. Okay, similar logic as before. Card looks at the input from the terminal, it compares it against its own processing around card risk management, and if it doesn't find a reason to either decline the transaction or to send it online, then it has no option but to default to the least strictest rule. which is approve the transaction offline. Okay. So to summarize, when the card is undergoing card action analysis, it needs the output of this phase must, it must come to a decision where it needs to generate a cryptogram in first gen AC, right? And so in card action analysis, what it'll try to do is first find the reason to decline a transaction, an AAC. And if it can't find one, then it's going to look for a reason to send the transaction online. And if it can't find one of those either, then it has no choice but to default to an offline approval for the transaction. Okay, so let's expand on it a little bit more, just to improve our understanding. If the terminal requests a decline, an AAC, okay, the card is not allowed, under the golden rule of EMV, it's not allowed to respond with anything other than an AAC. Okay, it has to abide by the strictest rule, which is decline the transaction. Right? So even though the card will eventually make the final decision, it is actually forced to abide by the golden rule. Okay, so in this scenario, the card only has it makes a final decision, right? But it only has one option to choose from, which is decline the transaction. Okay. If the terminal requests an ARQC, okay, this means that the card may not respond with anything that is more lenient than an ARQC. So the only options available to the card would be to generate either a decline, an AAC, or a go online, which is an ARQC. So in this scenario, unlike the first one, it now has two options to choose from. Choose the strictest one, which is to decline, and if not, then choose to go online. Okay. The third scenario is where the terminal requests an approval, a TC, right? In this instance, the card now has three options to choose from. And the three options being the strictest one, which is decline the transaction, the next strictest one, which is go online, and then the least strict option, which is approve the transaction offline. Okay. So that brings us to the end of this video, right? And to the end of card action analysis. In the next video, we are going to talk a bit about the first gen AC step. So the output of card action analysis will actually result in the cryptogram being generated in this next step, which is called first gen AC. Right? You'll see that it's there are actually two sort of bars here indicating first gen AC. The first one, relates to what happens if the first gen AC output isn't approved or declined, which means the transaction remains offline, as opposed to the other possible option where an ARQC is generated, in which case we need to send the transaction online. Now obviously, if we complete the transaction offline, then the transaction completes here. But if we choose to go online, then there are a few more steps. There are 4 more steps that we need to go through before we end the transaction. Right. So we'll cover this in a bit more detail in the next video. So thank you for spending the time with me, and I look forward to catching you guys in the next video. Cheers and bye-bye.